Somewhere over the South Atlantic Ocean, right now, there is almost nothing. No aircraft holding pattern. No contrails. No flights at all, really. Just 4,000 kilometers of open water sitting between two of the largest land masses on Earth, and a silence in the sky that, once you understand what it means, you cannot explain away. Here is the thing that stops people cold when they first hear it: Africa and South America are not far apart. At their closest points, the bulge of Brazil's northeastern coast and the jutting shoulder of West Africa, those two continents are separated by roughly 3,000 kilometers of ocean. That is less than the distance from New York to Los Angeles. It is less than a London to Dubai flight. You could drive that distance in 2.5 days if the road existed. And yet, the combined air traffic connecting these two landmasses, home to nearly 2 billion people, roughly 1/4 of every human being alive, amounts to a handful of flights per week, operated by a tiny number of airlines, almost all of them running in and out of a single city in Brazil. And here is the part that makes it stranger. There is a single airport sitting almost perfectly in the middle of the South Atlantic, a narrow runway on a British-American military island called Ascension, that most commercial aircraft are not legally allowed to land at. It is, in theory, the emergency lifeboat for the entire corridor. It is, in practice, largely off-limits. But the strangest part of all is this: 90 years ago, the South Atlantic was not an aviation dead zone. It was the most futuristic air corridor on Earth. There were flying boats. There were catapult ships firing aircraft into the sky mid-ocean. There was a hydrogen airship the length of 2.5 football fields crossing this water every other Saturday on a published timetable. This corridor was not forgotten, it was deliberately abandoned. And the reasons why tell you something uncomfortable about how the modern world actually got built. Let's go back to the beginning. On May 12, 1930, a French pilot named Jean Mermoz lifted off from St. Louis, in what is now Senegal, carrying 130 kilograms of mail in a single-engine floatplane. He was heading for Brazil. 21 hours later, he landed on the Rio Potengi River at Natal, on Brazil's northeastern coast. He had just completed the first commercial airmail crossing of the South Atlantic, a journey of roughly 3,200 kilometers over open ocean in an aircraft barely more sophisticated than what you might see at a county fair today. Mermoz was already a legend by then. He had crossed the Andes. He had established night mail routes down the spine of South America. He was the kind of pilot who looked at a windless tornado over the Atlantic and flew through it at 50 meters above the water because the mail had to get through. The French press called him the Archangel. His airline, Aéropostale, had built its entire purpose around connecting Europe to South America, and the crossing Mermoz made in May 1930 was the final link in that chain. The return crossing, it should be said, was a disaster. The aircraft was so fatigued after the first crossing that it took approximately 50 attempts to get it airborne again. When it finally did take off, an oil leak forced an emergency landing in the ocean. The crew was picked up by a passing ship. The aircraft sank. This was not an unusual outcome for South Atlantic aviation in the 1930s. But here is what matters: they kept going. Because while Mermoz and Aéropostale were risking their lives over the Atlantic from the African side, Germany was doing something even more audacious on the same route from Europe. Deutsche Lufthansa had identified the South Atlantic as the key to dominating the mail business between Europe and South America, and they had a plan that reads, today, like science fiction. A converted steamship called the Westphalen sat in the harbor at Bathurst, what is now Banjul in Gambia, loaded with a Dornier flying boat strapped to its deck. When conditions were right, the ship would sail southwest for a day and a half into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Then, from a catapult mounted on the deck, the same basic technology used to launch military aircraft from carrier ships, it would fire the flying boat into the air over open water. The aircraft, already fueled and loaded with mail, would then complete the crossing to Natal under its own power. 36 hours of sailing. A catapult launch in the middle of the ocean. Then a seaplane crossing to Brazil. By the end of 1934, a second catapult ship had been added, and transit times from Germany to Brazil had been cut to 3 days. By 1938, improvements in aircraft had driven that number below 40 hours. Meanwhile, there was something even larger in the sky. The LZ-127 Graf Zeppelin, a hydrogen airship 236 meters long, roughly the length of 2.5 football fields, began regular passenger and mail service across the South Atlantic in 1932. It crossed 18 times that first year. By 1934, the Zeppelin company was advertising a published schedule, departing Germany almost every other Saturday, bound for Brazil, with connecting flights onward to Argentina. In 1935 and 1936, the Graf Zeppelin schedule was almost entirely devoted to this one route. Over its operating life, it made 136 crossings of the South Atlantic, without a single accident on that route. Let that number absorb for a moment. A hydrogen-filled airship, in the 1930s, was a more reliable presence in South Atlantic skies than most commercial airlines are today. That corridor was not a dead zone. It was, by the standards of its era, one of the most active and ambitious aviation routes in the world. Then, in May 1937, the Hindenburg caught fire and exploded at its mooring mast in New Jersey, killing 36 people. Within weeks, the airship era was over. The Graf Zeppelin made its last flight that June and was never used again. And around the same time, another thread was unraveling. Jean Mermoz had continued flying the South Atlantic for years after his 1930 crossing it 23 times in total, accumulating a reputation as the most daring aviator alive. On December 7, 1936, he took off from Dakar in his Latecour 300 flying boat for what was supposed to be his 24th crossing. A short radio message was received from the aircraft. Then nothing. Mermoz, his crew, and his aircraft were never seen again. So by the late 1930s, the two great icons of South Atlantic aviation, the Zeppelin and the Archangel, had both been erased within months of each other. And then the Second World War arrived, and aviation resources everywhere were redirected entirely toward the conflict. After the war ended, the airlines that rebuilt global aviation did not look south. They looked north. This is the part of the story that most people miss. We tend to assume that air routes exist where geography makes them convenient. But the routes that exist today were not built by geography. They were built by history, and by money, and by colonial infrastructure that was never designed to connect Africa to South America at all. Think about what Africa's aviation map looked like in the 1950s and 1960s, as newly independent African nations were building their national airlines and their airports. Almost every route out of Africa ran north, to London, to Paris, to Lisbon, to Brussels. Because that is what the colonial infrastructure had been built for. The British built airports in Africa to connect their African holdings to Britain. The French built theirs to connect to France. The Portuguese connected to Portugal. Not one colonial power had any interest in building air corridors from Nairobi to Buenos Aires, or from Lagos to Sao Paulo, because that route served no colonial purpose whatsoever. And so when independence came, the new African airlines inherited an infrastructure pointing north, an air traffic system pointing north, and bilateral aviation agreements made with northern countries. The gravitational pull of that history did not disappear because colonialism ended. It just became invisible, embedded in which routes were commercially established, which city pairs had proven demand, which hubs had the ground handling and fuel capacity to support long-haul wide-body operations. Meanwhile, the aviation safety rules that govern over ocean flying created their own layer of complexity for the South Atlantic specifically. Modern commercial aircraft, and we are talking almost exclusively about twin-engine jets now, because the four-engine planes that dominated long-haul flying for decades have largely been retired, operate under rules called ETOPS, Extended Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards. The core requirement is simple to state and brutal in its implications. A twin-engine aircraft must never be more than a specified number of minutes of flying time from a suitable emergency diversion airport. For the most common ETOPS certification, that limit is 180 minutes on one engine. Some aircraft are certified for 240 or even 330 minutes. On the North Atlantic, this is manageable. There are the Azores, halfway across. There is Iceland. There is Newfoundland. There is a string of island airports that means a twin-engine jet flying from New York to London is never far from somewhere it can put down in an emergency. On the South Atlantic, between Africa and South America, south of the equator, there are, in the assessment of aviation operations specialists who actually plan these routes, essentially 3 airports worth considering as ETOPS alternates for the entire crossing. And all 3 have serious problems. The first is Ascension Island, sitting in the middle of the Atlantic, but Ascension's runway is a joint military facility operated by the British Royal Air Force and the United States Space Force, and under the terms of their agreement, only state aircraft are normally authorized to land there. In January 2013, a Delta Airlines Boeing 777 en route from Johannesburg to Atlanta did divert to Ascension after an engine problem. The runway has had its own issues, reports of surface deterioration leading to weight restrictions and the suspension of some flights. As an emergency option, it exists. As a reliable commercial infrastructure, it is something closer to a last resort. The second option is Fernando de Noronha, a small Brazilian island in the Atlantic, closer to the South American coast than to Africa. It has limited ground handling, no fuel available to non-Brazilian military aircraft, and requires a special landing permit. It functions. Barely. The third is St. Helena, the island most famous for being Napoleon's final exile, which only opened its commercial airport to regular passenger flights relatively recently, and whose runway has its own complications with wind patterns that made the opening years of operation more fraught than anyone had planned. So the infrastructure picture looks like this: 2 continents, nearly 2 billion people, roughly 3,000 kilometers at the narrowest crossing, and a mid-ocean emergency corridor that consists of a military airbase you probably cannot land at, a Brazilian island with no fuel, and Napoleon's prison island. There is a reason this corridor has only a handful of routes. And yet those routes do exist. That is important to say clearly, because the situation is not as simple as, no one flies here. Sao Paulo to Johannesburg is currently served by both South African Airways and LATAM Airlines, with combined weekly departures adding up to several flights each direction. TAAG Angola Airlines connects Luanda to Sao Paulo. Ethiopian Airlines connects Addis Ababa to Sao Paulo, serving the Brazil to Africa corridor as part of its remarkable expansion across the southern routes. In 2019, before the pandemic disrupted everything, more than 730,000 people flew between Africa and South America, most of them connecting through Europe or the Middle East rather than flying directly, adding thousands of kilometers and many hours to a journey that, on a map, looks perfectly straightforward. That number, 730,000 people, is worth sitting with. It is not a negligible number. It is a number that, in aviation terms, should be enough to support a healthy direct route network. And yet most of those people flew up to Paris or Dubai or Istanbul before flying back down. They traced a V-shape across the sky when a straight line was available, because the infrastructure for that straight line barely exists. The economics compound the absurdity. In the South Atlantic corridor, if you are flying between Cape Town and Sao Paulo on a modern twin-engine aircraft, you are doing something that is technically possible but commercially precarious. The aircraft capable of operating the route efficiently, the Airbus A350, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, have the range and the ETOPS certification. But the route still only generates a fraction of the passengers of a comparable North Atlantic service. The yields are lower. The connecting traffic that makes hub-and-spoke economics work on the North Atlantic, where a flight from New York to London is also carrying passengers from Boston, from Chicago, from Toronto who connected in New York, does not exist here in the same way, because neither Sao Paulo nor Johannesburg is an established global connecting hub for the kind of business traveler who books premium cabin tickets and makes routes profitable. And underneath all of this is the stubborn, statistical fact that the wealthiest passengers on both continents still tend to fly toward the north, because that is where the global economy's center of gravity has historically sat. The South Atlantic corridor connects parts of the world that are growing fast. Africa is projected to account for a quarter of the world's population by 2050, and several of its economies are among the fastest growing on Earth. but that growth has not yet translated into the kind of dense, high-yield passenger demand that makes airlines compete aggressively to add capacity. So what you end up with is a corridor that is simultaneously too close to be this empty and too underserved to become less empty. The lack of direct flights makes tickets expensive. The expensive tickets suppress demand. The suppressed demand gives airlines no reason to add routes. And the absence of routes perpetuates the lack of demand. It is a loop that has been running for decades. There are signs it is starting to break. South African Airways doubled its Johannesburg-Sao Paulo frequency in the 2025 to 2026 northern winter season. There is cautious, real commercial interest in the corridor for the first time in years. Ethiopia's expansion southward has quietly put African aviation into contact with South American cities in ways that would have seemed ambitious a decade ago. The economics are slowly shifting as both continents develop, as middle-class air travel demand grows on both sides of the water, and as the bilateral agreements that govern who can fly where between countries gradually loosen. But it is worth being honest about what it would take to make this corridor normal. It would take reliable, civilian-accessible diversion airports in the mid-Atlantic, which would require either significant investment in existing infrastructure on islands that have little economic reason to expand, or some kind of international aviation agreement that makes military fields accessible in genuine emergencies. It would take enough route competition to drive ticket prices down to levels that generate genuine leisure and business traffic. And it would take a generation of passengers on both sides of the ocean learning to think of direct Africa-South America travel as an option that exists, rather than defaulting to the European transit hub that their parents used. None of that is technically impossible. The aircraft exist. The distance is not prohibitive. The demand is latent. All the ingredients for a normal air corridor are present, and have been present, in some form, since a French pilot landed a seaplane on a Brazilian river in the spring of 1930 and proved that it could be done. The South Atlantic is not empty because it cannot be crossed. It is empty because the world built itself looking the other way, and the skies, as much as the maps, still show the shape of that choice. Some absences are accidents. Some are geography. And some are the long shadow of decisions made by people who are long dead, in a world that has changed around their legacy while the flight paths stayed the same.